Democrats are calling for stronger gun control in the wake of Tuesday's mass shooting in Texas. Debates have been swirling around how these mass shooting tragedies can and could have been avoided. It's when emotions are raw that it's easy to jump to conclusions with knee-jerk reactions. One thing that is undeniable is that there has been a dramatic uptick in mass shootings over the past 30 years, yet people still had easier access to the same types of guns prior to 1990. Here to assess some of the possibilities as to why we're seeing these upticks, we have founder of Patriot Academy, Rick Green. Rick Green, thank you so much for joining us in the Capitol Report again.
Good to be back with you, man.
Rick, this shooter in Texas, he posted on his social media shortly before the rampage. There are many different perspectives about if more could have been done from, Facebook. They're able to censor political news or different perspectives about the virus, yet they haven't picked up on things when he said that he was going to kill his grandmother and then was going to commit other acts that he wound up doing. But then there's the other side of the argument that this could open the door to more censorship from social media. What's your take?
Well, I'm always against censorship in general, but if you have actual threats, that's different. We're not even talking about censorship there at that point. You're talking about an opportunity for something to be brought to the attention of law enforcement and for them to investigate. If somebody says, that they're abusing children or they're going to do things like that, that's something that you would typically turn over to authorities. So, yeah, I think, when they so quickly will shut you down for questioning an election or questioning a virus, but yet they can't pay attention if somebody's saying that they're going to kill someone, then you've got to. What you've really got is a lack of values, a lack of moral clarity on the part of these companies. And honestly, man, I think that's what this all comes back down to. We're going to continue to have carnage like this, and we're going to continue to have carnage in big numbers like this, as long as we're not willing to pay attention to the laws of nature and just basic reality, basic good and evil. We've been living in this kindergarten fantasy that all ideas are the same, that everything's equal, that everything's morally relative, that anybody can have any truth that they want. And when you create an environment like that, that means anything goes. We've got to get back to acting like adults and calling good, good, and evil, evil.
Rick, to your point, long guns and guns, handguns in general, have been part of our culture and society since the founding, definitely in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as well. Yet we've seen this massive upticks in mass shootings starting roughly around the 90s. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot of things we could look at. I personally think that there is definitely a factor here that has to be attributed to psychotropic drugs. Almost every mass murder that has happened, the person that committed it was on some sort of psychotropic drug, especially when you're dealing with these young adults or teenagers that are involved in these kind of things. So I think that's a big part of it as well. But I also think it literally comes back to moral relativism, actually saying to the culture over and over and over again, what we teach in our schools, what the culture reinforces, is that there is no right and wrong, that there is no good or evil, that all of these ideas are the same. And that creates an environment where if you have a troubled kid, they start thinking that crazy thoughts that they have are okay as well because the culture is telling them to do anything. Now, what you're going to see happen right now, of course, politically, is everybody's going to look for some other excuse because we don't want to come back to that basic idea of good and evil. So it all comes back to the right philosophy. There's evil in the world and there's good in the world. And adults would recognize that there's evil in the world, and therefore we need more good. We need more good guys and gals with guns that are trained to defend whenever the wolf shows up.
Rick, I think you make a very interesting point. I mean, when you look at the moral values and just life in the 50s and 60s, it's definitely a stark contrast to the way we have developed over the past 2 decades. And even further to your point, we've heard many elected officials, specifically in Texas, Lieutenant Governor, members of Congress, they're saying that this will happen again unless we resolve the spirituality crisis in the country. Are we faced with a moral crisis from your perspective?
100%. I look at Paducah, Pearl, Jonesboro, Littleton, Santa Fe, now Uvalde, mass murder event after mass murder event. and you look at the things that are happening in the culture, and I think you can go back to Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we remove their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God?" And what he was saying was, if you remember your freedom comes from God, you live a certain way, you teach certain things, and you follow those principles. And so whether a citizen believes in God or not, or has faith or not, they have to recognize that society operates in a very different way when you believe in the laws of nature and nature's God as a culture. And so if you're teaching the culture that there are laws of nature and nature's God, the culture acts a certain way. Of course you're going to have outliers. Of course you're going to still have evil and crazy people that do crazy things. That's going to happen. But you're going to get a lot less of it if the culture is teaching right and wrong and encouraging people to do right.
Rick Green, thank you.
Good to be back with you.
Former Hillary Clinton campaign lawyer Michael Sussman told a federal court that he will not take the stand to testify in his own trial. Sussman is on trial for allegedly lying to the FBI. The charge came after he brought to the FBI derogatory information about then presidential candidate Donald Trump just ahead of the 2016 election. Sussman was representing Hillary Clinton's campaign at the time, but told the FBI that he was acting on his own accord. Sussman's decision not to take the stand came after an appeal by his attorneys to the judge. They tried to convince the judge not to allow Sussman to be questioned on negotiations he had with the government prior to being charged. And a New York State appeals court has ruled that former President Trump, along with Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr., must testify. A 4-judge panel upheld an earlier decision by a Manhattan judge to subpoena Trump and his children to testify. This is part of an investigation by New York Attorney General Letitia James into the Trump Organization's business practices. The Trumps could still appeal the ruling to the State Court of Appeals. If Trump is forced to testify, anything he says can be used against him in a criminal probe by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. The Secretary of State made a long-awaited speech explaining the administration's China policy. What did he say and what remains missing? NTD's Iris Tao has more.
Despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. is making clear that China remains the greatest threat to world order.
Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China.
In a Thursday speech, Secretary of State Antony Blinken articulated the Biden administration's China strategy in 3 words.
Invest, align, compete.
That means to invest domestically, work with allies, and outperform China in key areas. The goal is to defend global rules against China's behaviors.
We cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So, we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system.
Blinken also called out Beijing's unfair trade practices, human rights abuses, and aggressive actions in the South China Sea. That said,
so he was pointing these things out, but not giving any real sense or concrete specifics of what you're actually going to do.
Grant Newsham, a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy, says Blinken failed to outline specific actions.
The Chinese communists would listen to this and say, okay, and you're not, that's all? You're not going to do anything? Well, we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
And Blinken notably said the U.S. is not seeking a Cold War with China, adding,
We do not seek to transform China's political system.
Secretary said, we don't want to change the Chinese communist system. Well, the Chinese are sure out to change ours. And you didn't see any real sense of urgency or concern.
The Secretary of State did not mention how the administration will handle trade disputes or whether it will lift the Trump-era tariffs on China. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
A group of bipartisan senators is urging President Biden to keep Section 301 tariffs in place to continue targeting China's unfair trade practices. These lawmakers are concerned that the Biden administration has publicly signaled to lift the tariffs, and they say that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party would want. The Trump administration reached a Phase 1 agreement with China in 2020, but China has failed to comply with it. These senators are urging the Biden administration to hold China accountable based on the agreement. led by Republican Senator Rob Portman, 8 other senators from both parties signed onto the letter. One of the top security officials on Capitol Hill would like to keep members of Congress from carrying firearms into the building. House Sergeant-at-Arms William Walker says he does not believe lawmakers should carry guns into the U.S. Capitol complex. In his letter, Walker admits his opinion on the issue is not held by most. Currently, members of Congress are allowed to carry firearms in office buildings if they are licensed in Washington, D.C. However, guns in certain areas are restricted, such as on the House floor. A final decision to extend those restrictions is up to the Capitol Police Board. That includes the House Sergeant-at-Arms, the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, and the architect of the Capitol.